it would be a great shame if people were to think that you're writing this forward to Solzhenitsyn was simply to document something as an historic phenomenon, as essentially important as that historic documentation is. It seems to me that what is of interest to you is not simply to shed light on the terrors, the 100 million slaughtered in the course of the various communist revolutions of the 20th century, those various ideologies motivated by Marxism and other forms of philosophical ideology, but because it seems to me that you take what was present in that philosophically, ideologically, still to be at work or to have been, as it were, reborn in the West. And so I suppose what I'd like to ask you about is, what are the characteristics of the Marxist ideology that led to those that very obvious death and destruction, which in a subtler way you see to be, am I right to say, you see to be at work in the West? So I'd like, it seems to me very important that we have a deep sense of what the governing assumptions of our culture are, or it's hard to transcend them.
Yeah, well, that is exactly the issue, because the question is whether or not the past is over. I mean, there's a Marxist philosopher named Richard Wolff who challenged me recently on YouTube to a debate, and really the answer that I posted was this forward, and he accused me of being stuck in the past. You know, it's, well, the wall fell in 1989 and the horrors of the Soviet era are over, and we can't we can't eternally tar Marxism with the brush of these past events. I mean, as if these events are over, or as if 50 years is sufficient time to forget about the corpses. But that's his idea, you know. And to me, it's the same idea that you might put forward if you were a neo-Nazi, by saying that, well, you know, all that happened back in 1945. The fundamental doctrine was sound, and we can't allow our judgment about these eternal truths manifested in the National Socialist doctrine to be forever tainted by some unfortunate historical events. And I think that that's just, well, I don't even know what to say about it. I mean, one of the telling things about his comments was that he only talked about the Soviet Union and not all the other terrible places that the same doctrine had been implemented with equally murderous effects. And so that was quite the argument by evasion. But what I try to do in the foreword and in my thinking in general is I'm always trying to get to the bottom of things. What's at the bottom? And it seems to me that what happened, if you look at what happened in the Russian Revolution, like, the first thing you want to do is give the devil his due. Okay, and the way you do that is by pointing out that hierarchical structures, no, we'll start even before that. People have problems that have to be solved. Life is a sequence of problems that have to be solved. If you don't solve the problems that life puts forward, you suffer and you die. So assuming that you don't want those two outcomes, then there are problems you have to solve. And so you have to set an aim, and the aim is to solve the problem. And then, because we're social creatures, we have to solve the problems by organizing collectively. And the way we do that, generally speaking, in relationship to an aim, is to produce a hierarchy. And the reason for that is that if you have a problem and you want it to be solved and you get a variety of people working on it, you're soon going to discover that some people are much better at solving the problem than others. And that will inevitably produce a hierarchy. And it should, because then even the structure of authority is in sync with the aim. And the aim is valuable because it's a problem that everybody agrees that is an actual problem. So you're going to get hierarchical organizations, and you should. Now, the problem with that is that as soon as you produce a hierarchical organization, two things happen. One is that a small minority of the people do almost all the creative work. That's the Pareto principle. And the other is that the benefits of the hierarchy flow disproportionately to a small number of people at the top. So, and that's another manifestation of the Pareto principle, and it is something that Marx pointed out, although he blamed it on capitalism, which is a big mistake, even if you're concerned for those the hierarchy dispossesses. So you produce a hierarchy, both the work flows from a minority of people and the benefits flow to a minority of people. And those might not be the same people, by the way, right? Because hierarchies aren't perfect in their ability to distribute resources as a consequence of productive effort. That's part of the problem with hierarchical organizations. but then what the hierarchy does is produce a layer of the dispossessed that stack up at the bottom, near zero, and it's the majority. It's always the majority. So that's the price you pay for hierarchies. Now, what the left does is say, look at the dispossessed, and keep the hierarchy flexible enough so that it can twist and bend and transform when necessary, but also so that the dispossessed don't fall so close to zero that A, that they're done, they're in misery, B, that the talents they might possess can't be utilized, and C, that the whole structure doesn't become so untenable that it destroys itself because of the inequality. Perfectly reasonable propositions. And so then you could say, well, there's a certain number of people on the left who are genuinely motivated by concern about dispossession as well as the dispossessed.
Of course.
Fine. So that's to give the devil his due. And so then you might say, well, there were moral reasons for at least a subset of those who were involved in the Russian Revolution to be involved. They were interested in helping the dispossessed. But there's a problem. And this is the problem of the left. There's problems on the right as well. The problem on the right is once the hierarchy is established, those who dominate the top have every right to overstate the moral virtue of the hierarchy because it privileges them in particular. On the left, the problem is that it's not easy to distinguish between care for the dispossessed and hatred for those who occupy positions of, well, you could say authority. The leftists would say power. You could also say competence, which I think is more to the case, or ability. It's not easy to distinguish care for the dispossessed from hatred for those who occupy the preeminent positions in the hierarchy. And if it's power, then it's hatred for power. But if it's competence, and it is competence if the hierarchy is functional, then it's hatred for the competent. Okay, then you say, all right, so those are the two competing motivations. Care for the dispossessed and hatred for the, let's say, competent. Let's play that out, historically speaking, and see which is the more powerful force. Well, that got played out very rapidly in the Russian Revolution. And what happened was, even if there was a minority, and perhaps even a majority, although there wasn't, but perhaps even a majority of those who truly cared for the dispossessed, those who hated the competent, slaughtered them. It turned out that the hatred was a much more potent geopolitical force than the compassion. And then another twist occurred too, because the narrative was bourgeoisie against proletariat, let's say, and so that's those at the uppermost pinnacle of the hierarchy against those who were the dispossessed. And that was also the historical narrative. And then it was the right and responsibility of those who were oppressed to rise up. But that ran into another problem, which is basically the problem that the postmodernists, especially on the feminist side, have now identified as intersectionality. It's like, well, it turns out that you can't so easily be placed into one group. Like, in fact, this is the perception problem that we talked about before. There's a very large number of groups you could be placed in. It might be an unlimited number of groups, in fact. And so then, if you're motivated primarily by hatred and your desire is to produce as much mayhem as possible, you can take any given person and you can analyze the multiple groups that they belong to, and then you can find one group in which they're the oppressor. And then, because there's no excuse whatsoever for the oppression, even if there's one dimension of your identity along which you're an oppressor, then you're grist for the bone-crushing mill of the Soviet work camp. And that's exactly what happened. And so as the Soviet Revolution progressed, more and more people got thrown into the cauldron, let's say. The socialists, the students, the religious people, the original revolutionaries. Stalin had all them killed because there was some, and if it wasn't you that was guilty because of your group membership, then they just expanded the capacity of the parameters of the idea of group. Well, you're not an oppressor, but your grandfather was a landowner. Well, that's good enough. That's your class. And so that's sufficient justification to throw you to the wolves as well. And so what you saw is this just unbelievable expansion of murderousness driven by the twin improper presuppositions that you could define people by their group identity, and that history was best conceptualized as a battle between the fortunate and the unfortunate along those group identities.
Yes.